Welcome back to my channel. Okay, let's get into this one right here. We got a good one for you. If you never heard of this guy, Anthony Johnson, he was the first official slave master of the United States, right? For a slave to serve a life sentence was because of this guy, Anthony Johnson, went to the court and demanded that this happened for the first time. Everything before that was indentured slavery, right? Indentured slavery, right? So some people heard about this guy. I've heard videos out there. I don't too much like their spin on it. It was on Fox News a long time ago. It's part of what happened in the United States when we talk about slavery. It's part of history. So why don't they teach this in school? Why don't, your so-called Pan-Africans teach this? Well, they won't teach this because if you really teach this in school or Pan-Africans, the whole African slave lie just becomes what it is, a lie. In that, the Civil War, what they was fighting for, it becomes a lie. The Jim Crow laws, it becomes a lie. I keep saying, well, there was law in it. All this stuff for so-called black people, it is a lie. It's half truth. And when you could just tell these stories, made up stories, or your own version of what happened, then you can have people feeling sorry for themselves, right? They don't know the real history in the world or America. So we're going to read about this guy, Anthony Johnson, and we're going to, kind of debate some of the stuff they got in here that doesn't make no sense, because we can go back and look at his genealogy. Now, genealogy is big, right? It trumps any, swab in the mouth that they're trying to put you over here in Asia or Africa or wherever. You're part this, all of it's nonsense. Genealogy trumps everything. It trumps everything, right? A lot of people don't know their genealogy. A lot of people want to call themselves something they ain't because this is what they heard on TV or heard in the schools. If you don't know your genealogy, you don't know who you are. That's just how it is. If you don't know history, you don't know who you are, because these people in school or schools aren't here to teach you to exact the history of the world, right? They're here to teach you what they want you to do in the world of commerce to make money. That's about it. So if you don't go back and look at what they've already documented, the government in the history of America, in the history of the world, all this is documented, you will never know. And you always cry, you always blame, you always talk about black and white, you always, be a fool. Be a fool. Basically, that's all you'll be. So let's talk about this guy, Anthony Johnson. And I like to look at Wikipedia just because they give the sources in which they're talking about, whether it's the government, whether it's the Constitution, whether it's, somebody who wrote this book and stuff like this. I don't like to go to random people who just wrote an article and try to put their spin on it, right? Wikipedia can get you back to the laws of when this happened and, all this different stuff. It can sometimes be random, but basically it's a lot of people on here that's putting their own spin on it, and they don't really have any sources of what they're talking about. So let's talk about this guy, Anthony Johnson. So it says right here, Anthony Johnson, he was born 1600 and lived all the way to 1670. Wow. 70 years. They telling us that people was only living until 24 back then for a man. 30 years old, how was this guy able to live until 70 years old? Right? And they tell us now, starting in the 1900s and stuff gotta get all these vaccines, man. These people back then, they didn't live that long because they was dying of all these diseases. That's not true. I've looked up so much genealogy, it's not funny. These people were living 100 years, 80 years, 70 years, even longer than that, without no vaccines. It's made up. There's people who die early like it ain't nothing today. And like I said, let me know in a comment if you want me to, maybe we can make a deal. You can cash at me or something like that, but I can do your genealogy. I'm pretty much an expert at this stuff, So if you want me to find your family, just let me know. So Anthony Johnson was born in 1600 to 1670, was an England born man who achieved wealth in the early 1600s. Colony of Virginia, held as an indentured servant in 1621, he earned his freedom after several years and was granted land in the colony. So let's keep going down. He later became a tobacco farmer in Maryland. He attained great wealth and completed his term an indentured servant, and has been referred to as the first um, black patriarch of the first community of the Negro property owners in America. Well, we might have to debunk that, but whatever. This guy owned property. He owned property. So let's look at his biography. In the early 1620s, African slave traders kidnapped a man who would later be known as Anthony Johnson in Portuguese Angola, and sold him to Portuguese slavers. Hold on. So African slave traders? Okay. And they sold him to Portuguese slavers, right? Just remember that. Who named him Antonio. They didn't say what age. They just said kidnapped the man who would later be known as Anthony Edwards. I mean Anthony Anthony Johnson. I'm stuck on basketball so hard. So they named him Antonio. Antonio. That's Antonio, right? As an indentured servant, Antonio worked for a merchant at the Virginia Company. You know what the Virginia Company is? You might want to go check that out, right? I'm talking about King Edwards, who built, established the Virginia. Well, no, I think it was a James. Was it the James Company? No, it was a Virginia Company. King James owned this. Let me see if I can click on it. Um, yeah, the Virginia Company was an English trading company chartered by King James in 1606 with the objective of colonizing the eastern coast of America. The company was named Virginia after Elizabeth I. So basically, I'm gonna tell you guys this stuff ahead of time. You could not get into the Americas from Europe, right? Unless you went through the king. That's it. The king's word was bond. You could not get to America without the king, right? So the king set up a company over here, the Virginia Company, and what they did was they made deals with the Indians. This whole thing is a lie, where they came over here and killed all these Indians. Yes, they did later on have wars with Indians, but you got to remember it was Indians that was fighting on the side of Europeans to take Indian land away from Indians, right? And kill them, take their land, because the Europeans and the Indians became friends, right? They even later on, we could do a story about that. They mixed in with each other, blah, blah, blah. So King James came over here, did a charter, did a deal with these Indians, and that's how Europeans were able to settle over here, right? So Europe was going to hell. There was nothing over there. When they came to the Americas, they basically seen heaven. They had all the fruits, the vegetables, the medicines, the trees, everything. Everything was in the Americas. They couldn't believe it. And you can read stories about that too. There was nothing in Europe. It was going to hell. So anyways, the king set up basically a company over here, the Virginia Company, and made a deal with the Indians, blah, blah, blah. So that's how they were able to come over here and colonize. They will sell goods up out of the United States or the Americas and send them back to Europe and sell them. This was his company. Now you did have companies, men over here, businessmen doing business over here, right? But you had to pay taxes to the Virginia Company, right? So if you wasn't a real businessman that was over here setting up business, you had to come over here as an indentured slave to work in these businesses. In what was getting sent back to Europe, everything: trees, paper, vegetables, fruits, furs, everything that was in America's, chocolate, tobacco, you name it. was getting sent back over there. You got to remember, it was really like no technology or nothing like that. So, or machinery. So the people were the technology in the machinery and stuff like that. They were the workers. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So nobody came over here as real slaves. The only people that came over here as real slaves were the people who were POWs, caught in war, or lost in war, and maybe they were sold into slavery. So where were we? Anthony Johnson in Portuguese Angola and sold him to Portuguese slavers who named him Antonio and sold him into the Atlantic slave trade. A colonist in Virginia bought Antonio. Who was the colonist? They never say who the colonist was because we can just go look him up on record. Like we're going to look him up on record. As an indentured servant, indentured servant, Antonio worked for a merchant at the Virginia Company. What I tell you, at the Virginia Company. He also received into the Roman Catholic Church. Wow. So let me tell you something real quick before we move on. And why are they saying Angola? Angola wasn't established until like the 1700s. This is the 1600s. Most people don't even understand that most of these names, these countries in Africa, they weren't established until like the 1700s, and the majority of them until the late to early 1900s when the Europeans really took over Africa. So all these names in Africa are basically new. They weren't around in the 1700s, and some not even in the 1800s. So of course he didn't come from Angola. There was no Angola back then. And why would you name him Antonio? That doesn't make it unless you stole like a little kid. I don't know. He sailed to Virginia in 1621 aboard the James, the Virginia Mustard of the 1624 census list. His name as Antonio not given, recorded as a Negro in the notes column. Historians dispute whether this was the same Antonio, later known as Anthony Johnson, as the census list. Several men named Antonio. This was one. This is one is considered the most likely. So what they're saying is we're trying to make up this story that really isn't exactly true. That he was this Antonio guy, but instead he was Anthony all the time. And that maybe he really didn't come from Angola. Because we already told you Angola wasn't a country until 1700s. What you guys got to remember is when we was talking about the people coming over here as indentured servants in the 1600s behind King James, no one, you guys got to remember, these guys in Europe did not have technology back then and all that stuff. Everything was kept through books in detail, right? In detail. You'd be shocked how the people lived back then. Everything was kept. These people was really intelligent. They didn't have computers, none of that stuff. So when you arrived to the port, this was all done with treaties, all this stuff. So people would know what the hell is going on. They kept records. So if you came to the port, you came to a certain port. Remember, you just couldn't go where you wanted to go in the Americas. If you was coming from Europe and you just was sneaking over here, these Indians would destroy you. There's millions of these people just sitting at every coast, right? So that's what I'm trying to tell you. King James eventually, when he set up in Virginia, needed to make a treaty and a deal with these Indians, right? So they can colonize. The stories that they tell you guys of these people just came in on this ship and just killed all these Indians and set up colonies. You're an idiot. You can even go back and look at history. We can do a whole video on that. Who they who they made deals with, friended with, treaties, everything. This is part of history. So when you came to the port, it was a shit manifest. The list of passengers, who they were getting sold to, everything was extensive. That's what I'm trying to tell you, people. If you really want to go back and look at your genealogy, you can find it. People are being lazy. I don't care if you say they came from Africa. They were being listed of where they came from. And most of us already know most of your black Europeans, I mean, black people that came over came from Europe and Spain. And they have been living there for thousands of years. It's all made up nonsense, right? We go back, look at the shit manifest and all that stuff of the so-called black people coming over here, and they got first, last names with their children, everything. Johnson was sold as an indentured servant to a white planter named Bennett to work on his Virginia tobacco farm. Slave laws were not passed until 1661 in Virginia. Before that day, Africans were not officially considered enslaved, right? So he came over in 1621, right? Think about what these people are saying. So on your screen, you can see, when we go through his genealogy, I'm not bullshitting. It's up there. Such workers typically worked under a limited indenture contract for 4 to 7 years to pay off their passage, room, board, and lodging, and freedom dues. This is not exactly true, man. I've looked this up. They're called slave payrolls. Look them up. These people were getting paid while they were working. Paid. I'm gonna give you that word again. In slave payrolls. It don't matter what they try to say now on what they mean. These people were getting paid. Where were we? In the earlier colonial years, most Africans in the 13 colonies were held under such contracts of limited indentured servitude. Except for those indentured for life, they were released after a contract period. Remember, the ones that were held for life. Why? Because they broke some law. They were prisoners or something like that, not because of their skin color. Those who managed to survive their period of indentured would receive land and equipment after their contracts expired or were bought out. Most white laborers in this period also came to the colonies as indentured servants. So this is crazy because we're talking about, I don't know. Let me see. Let's go back up to the Virginia, to the Virginia company. Where is it at? Let me see if I can. Virginia. They're saying 1624. No. The Crown Colony was in 1624. Jamestown started, let me see, blah, 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 blah. Well, what I'm trying to tell you is that these people, so-called Africans, were coming over all this time. And you already know people back then were having massive amount of children. They having like 12, a woman would have like 12 to 13 children in a lifetime, right? So this dude wasn't the first black guy to come over here. Wasn't the first black guy to come over here. Wasn't the first. So these people are just coming over here, doing their time with these black people, having all these children. How can, let's keep going. Because you won't know what I'm talking about if I'm just talking. Oh, I kind of lost where I was at first. Oh, Antonio almost died in the Indian massacre of 1622, when Bennett's plantation was attacked, the Powhatans, um, who were the indigenous Indian people, indigenous dominant, they got this whole thing messed up. Who were the indigenous people dominant at the time in the Tidewater region of Virginia? So when they say certain people are indigenous, what does that mean? Right? That means you can't, if you're indigenous to that land, you didn't come from another land. Like if I come from Siberia, right? If I migrated from Siberia, right? If I migrated from South Siberia, I cannot be indigenous to the Americas, right? So people need to kind of rethink what they've been told about people, Siberian people migrating to the Americas and being indigenous. They're not indigenous to this land. They're indigenous to Siberia. Um, so we're dominant at the time in the Tidewater region of Virginia were attempting to evict the colonists, right? And it's funny when you look up Anthony Johnson, when you go to Wikipedia, they list him under colonist, right? They don't they don't list him under African slave. They list him under colonist, right? They raided the settlement where Johnson worked on Good Friday and killed 52 of 57 men present. And that's what I'm trying to tell you guys. You just can't come over here to the Americas and just go wherever you wanted to. These people was going to F you up, these Indians was. It was going to F you up. It didn't ride like that. And even though King James made a deal with some Indians so they could get some land and do work over here and take shit up out of here, the Indians still around where that was, they wasn't having it. They didn't like these people. It didn't matter what color they was. They were black. They was white. They weren't having it. They weren't having it. And they didn't like them. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Couldn't no people come over here off a ship 100 at a time and you're dealing with millions and millions and millions, 100 million Indians on this land. You're going to get messed up. So basically, the only protection, I won't say the only protection, they protected themselves, the colonists and the people who came from Europe, but they had extra help from Indians, right? That they made deals with. In 1623, a black woman named Mary arrived arrived aboard the ship Margaret. She was brought to work on the same plantation as Antonio, where he was the only, well, she was the only woman present. Antonio and Mary married and lived together for more than 40 years. We kind of found out this story was a lie. Somebody did a video and found out that she actually came from Europe. And it didn't even say where she came from. And we'll look at the genealogy in a minute, but yeah. So another thing is, what I want to ask you guys, like, they're bringing him over here from so-called Africa, right? But it was a Portuguese who colonized in Africa, right? So it's no surprise that his name was Antonio when he came over. Oh goodness, the Portuguese were already colonized over there at that time in the 1600s. And let's just keep going. I don't want to get it mixed up. Sometimes in 1635, Antonio and Mary concluded their terms of their indentured servitude. Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. Oh, that's what I was going to say. So you're coming over here to these Englishmen and you're being slaves. How are they even talking to you? How are they telling you how to do the work? You're supposed to be speaking African language. And how are the Portuguese talking to the Englishmen? I guess they had a lot of interpreters back then. I don't know. I'm not for sure. But they just act like this stuff was just like, easy, right? How do you know how to plant crops in a land that you've never been to, right? If you plant a crop in Florida, it's different from planting a crop in Indiana. A crop, as far as growing it, maintaining it, all that stuff is different in damn Idaho than it is in, let's say, Texas. Who's teaching these people this stuff? It takes a long time to figure this stuff out and how these crops grow on the land. So let's keep going. Yeah, they got done with their slavery. Antonio and his wife, indentured servitude. Antonio changed his name to Anthony Johnson. He first entered the legal record on an was a indentured man when he purchased a calf in 1647. The colonial government granted listen to this. The colonial government granted Johnson a large plot of farmland after he paid off his indentured contract by his labor. So I guess that was in around 1635. That's what they were saying. On July 24, 1651, he acquired 250 acres of land under the head right system by buying the contracts of 5 indentured servants, one of whom was his son, Richard Johnson. The head right system worked so that if a man were to bring indentured servants over to the colonies, in this particular case, Johnson brought the 5 servants. He was on no, they got this thing all mixed up. He was on 50. Oh, he was owed 50 acres, a head or servant. The land located on the Grand Creek. They'll just tell me where the land was. So this guy got 250 acres back then. The government. And I'm trying to tell you guys, when we talk about this, we're not acting like this guy was the first black man who was getting this stuff. And in fact, this was like early on. They just have put in. He came over here in what was it? Did they say 1624? 1624. The Virginia Company was just formed. It was just formed. Y'all gotta stop, man. And then he got slaves and all this stuff. So the real story is, man, these dudes were coming over here, indentured workers. You know, they could do skilled work like farming. They could be some type of mechanic on a machine. They could, be a teacher. They could be a doctor. Anything. But they had to do it through indentured servitude first, unless they came over here as businessmen. Nevertheless, the king was getting paid because, if you got land after your indentured servitude was up, you was selling that stuff back to the colonies. I mean, not to the colonies, back to Europe. All the stuff I told you about, you pretty much got a company. You basically got a company. After that, all these goods were getting shipped back. And the king, he was taxing all this stuff. Tax. Anything you sold over there back to Europe, the king was taxing it and getting paid. Anything that was getting sold in his colony to the people that was already here, whether it was the colonists, whether the people that came over here as indentured slaves, all that stuff was getting taxed when it was sold by the king. So the king was getting paid. Right? Let me see. And yeah, I guess this guy don't know English still, right? How did he learn English? How do these people learn English? Ain't no school to go to. How do these people know English to even talk to these English slaves that they're getting out? To the English people that's around. Let me see. I lost where I was. Oh, here we are. Johnson ran a tobacco farm using indentured servants, right? One of those servants, John Casser, will later become one of the first African men to be declared indentured for life, right? Is it Casser or Caser? Whatever it is, that sounds like a Spanish name to me. The last name. In 1652, an unfortunate fire caused great loss for the family, and Johnson applied to the courts for tax relief. Wow, these black people get these Africans. I thought this thing was so. Where did the racism come in there? I just don't understand. And that's why I was gonna do the Jim Crow. Because there was no such thing as racism before Jim Crow. And I'm going to show you. It's all made up. These black people was living good, having slaves, doing all this stuff in America. Um, Let me start over. Anthony Johnson, ran a tobacco farm using indentured servants. One of those servants, John Kaser, would later become one of the first African men to be declared indentured for life. In 1652, an unfortunate fire caused great losses for the family, and Johnson applied to the courts for relief. The courts reduced the family's taxes. Reduced the family's taxes, and on February 28th, 1652, exempted his wife Mary and her two daughters from paying taxes during their natural lives. I'm trying to tell you, who else would do this? You think a white racist judge would do anything like? Come on, man. You can't even rule out that the judges was black back then. These people was telling you a crazy story today. At that time, taxes were levied on people, not property. Not property. Under the 1645 Virginia Taxation Acts, all Negro men and women and all other men from the age 16 to 60 shall be judged paying taxes. People, not property. So today, levied on people, not property. So today, you got to pay property tax. I'll let you figure that out. It is unclear from the records why the Johnson women were exempt. You know how much money you making now that you ain't got to pay taxes? What do you mean it's unclear? This dude was making major moves back then. He was something. He was somebody. He was somebody. Just because you had a loss in a fire, all of a sudden you could just fake that then. If that's the case, now you don't have to pay taxes no more at all. So what's going on now? He just put everything in her name. It is unclear from the records why the Johnson women were exempt, but the change gave them the same social standing as white women who were not taxed. During the case, the justices noted that Anthony and Mary had lived in habits in Virginia above the 30 years and had been respected for their hard labor and known service. Goodness gracious. Imagine, it's a guy who did videos on this, and they were telling how it was hundreds and hundreds in the height of slavery, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of black people that not only own land, that own slavery, that had businesses, everything at the height of the Civil War. What y'all don't understand is, again, back then, and I've even checked my genealogy, and this is even a fact, that everybody back then was having 12 or more children in a lifetime. Well, I'm not going to say all of them, but let's just say about 8 to 12. If you actually stayed with that same woman. Now maybe you would have divorced her and got with another woman and had some more children or something, but they was having massive families. So what I'm trying to explain to you, you got to just imagine how many black people are free back then. And we'll do a video on the 12 Years a Slave, right? You ever seen that movie? They throw it in your face that all these black people was free in the North, right? And they was just coming down here to steal slaves and take them back up north. But they're not really telling you the whole story. They're not telling you the story that black people owned slaves from the beginning. From the beginning of when the colony started. Many black people. Whether you want to call them Africans, people with any sense, we don't call them Africans. We call them Europeans because we know where they came from. They came from Europe when we look at the ship manifest. They didn't come from Africa. It's all a lie. Where we at? Um, by the 1650s, Anthony and Mary Johnson were farming 250 acres in Northampton County, while their two sons owned 550 acres. When I tell you this, he don't just think about this dude. Think about all the Negroes that came over with him, and all the Negroes that came on the ships behind him. In this time, it's ridiculous. Quit trying to. It's a lot, a lot. But anyways, like I was saying, the movie 12 Years a Slave. We could do a video on this. How at the end of the movie, well, they stole him from up north, right? A black guy who was living middle class, was college educated, living in an all black neighborhood, and he thought he was doing a business deal with these white guys, and they put something in his drink. When he went to the bathroom, he drank it, passed out later on, and they took him down south and they sold him, right? And he kept saying, I'm not a slave, with the other slaves, and they was laughing and all this stuff. And at the end of when 12 years passed, they finally came and they found him and came down to the plantation, and the authority said, you got to let him go or something like that, whatever his name was. And he had his paperwork, and the plantation owner he was pissed, but he had no choice but to let him go. And he went back up north with his family. And black people just walked out the movie like, what are you talking about? And we'll probably do a whole video on that. What they tell you in history when they tell you stuff in history, you got to question the rest of it. And you got to say, well, this kind of don't make no sense if you're saying this. But I don't know why black people don't do this. Yeah, so the family was rich. If you own land and you was doing business, you was rich back then. Why do you think all these people was coming to the Americas for land and the grow crops? That was the end all be all, really. Growing crops is food and selling it back over there. Or you could do other stuff. You could be, sell fur after you kill all the animals here. You could, ship back trees, tobacco, marijuana, coffee, all kind of stuff. You could get rich. It was very little of that in Europe. It was all crowded. People was dying. It wasn't no medicine. All that stuff, man. Europe was pretty much finished. So let's look at this. When Anthony Johnson was released from his servitude, I don't know why I keep going on with this. He was legally recognized as a free Negro. He became a successful farmer. In 1651, he owned 250 acres in the service of 5 indentured servants, 4 white, 1 black. In 1653, John Castor, a black indentured servant whose contract Johnson appeared to have bought in the early 1640s, approached Captain Goldsmith, claiming his indenture had expired 7 years earlier. Damn. And that he was being held illegally by Johnson. A neighbor, Robert Parker, intervened and pursued Johnson to free Castor. Parker offered Castor work, and he signed a term of indenture to the planter. Johnson filed a freedom suit against Parker in court in 1654 for the return of Castor. The court initially found in favor of Parker, but Johnson appealed in 1655. The court reversed the ruling, finding that Anthony Johnson still owned John Castor. The court ordered that he be returned with the court dues paid by Robert Parker. Wow. This was the first instance in a judicial determination in the 13 colonies, holding that a person who had committed no crime could be held in servitude for life. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. There was no such thing of slavery for life, right? Before that, only prisoners of war and people who committed crimes. Let me see. The Castor lawsuit demonstrated the culture and mentality of planters in the mid-17th century. Individuals made assumptions about the society of Northampton County and their place in it. According to historians T.H. Breen and Stephanie Innes, Castor believed he could form a stronger relationship with his patron, Robert Parker, than Anthony Johnson had developed over the years with his patrons developed. Casher considered, what's it say? Was it Casher considered the dispute to be a matter of patron-client relationship, and this wrongful assumption resulted in his losing his case in the court and having the ruling against him. Johnson knew that the local justices shared his fundamental belief in the sanctity of property. The judge sided with Johnson, although in future legal issues, race played more prominent roles. I just don't know what to say on some of this stuff, man. It's to think that black people actually had power in the 1600s is ludicrous. And we're sitting here today talking about slavery, and then you wonder why you can't get no reparations for slavery. How you going to get reparations for slavery when black people, basically, it says right here, started slavery for life? How black people was owning all these slaves, all this land. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. I had to do this first before I could even get to Jim Crow. Because what they saying in the Jim Crow thing makes no sense. Not saying it didn't happen, but in the way it happened, they're not telling the truth. The Castro lawsuit was an example of how difficult it was for Africans who were indentured servants to prevent being reduced to slavery. Most Africans could not read and had almost, well, if you're trying to tell me these Africans came over here as indentured servants, then there was a whole bunch of Africans over here talking to Africans who was enslaved. That's another thing to me, and I never got this. Like all these Africans came over here by the millions, so they would have set up some type of African society, churches, schools, all this stuff. And and they said they were still bringing African slaves over here up until slavery was over. So man, it would have been a whole bunch of black people still talking this language, no doubt about it, no doubt about it. Still, because that's one thing you can't teach these. It's hard to teach older people a foreign language in which the country that they're coming to. It's hard. So I don't know how so-called black people, if they came from Africa, how come you came out of slavery speaking English right away, and you were in political positions, go over this, and doing all this stuff. You should have came up out of slavery still spitting African language like it was nothing, and still to this day. I don't understand it. And you would have started all this African stuff after this was over, right? They said you couldn't go to school, all this Jim Crow stuff happened. It would have been massive populations of black people speaking African, and the whole African culture still going around. The whole African movement really didn't come back around until what? The sick, I don't know, like big until like the 80s, and everybody rocking like African this, African that, but ain't nobody teaching no African language. You could rock Africa this and have African pictures and African clothes. How come you ain't speaking the language? How come these Pan Africans ain't teaching the language? That's gonna separate you in society into a nation of your own people, just like the Asians be speaking Japanese, Chinese, wherever they come from. The Spanish speaking, Spanish. Everybody speaking their language except for the so-called African Americans who are told they're from Africa. But where's the second language in school? I thought it was African. So where's the dialect in school? So the second language here is Spanish. Why? If the majority of people for so long have always been white Europeans, supposedly, and black Africans, how come the second language wasn't always some African dialect? It don't make no sense to me. Um, where was we? Um, Planters found it easy to force them into slavery after. No, let's read it from the beginning. The Casher lawsuit was an example of how difficult it was for Africans who were indentured servants to prevent from being reduced to slavery. Most Africans could not read and had almost no knowledge of English. Planters found it easy to force them into slavery by refusing to acknowledge the completion of their indentured contracts. This is what happened to Anthony. No, what this is This is what happened in Johnson versus Parker. Although the two white planters confirmed that Castor had completed his indentured contract with Johnson, the court still ruled in Johnson's favor. So a black man did this to another black man? And this wasn't even when actually slavery was for life. We'll have to do a video on that. I think that was in the early 1700s. No, 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 no. I want to say the early 1800s. It was a case. So even though this case was an individual case, everybody still coming over was still indentured, right? It was just now that every slave master could use this case to keep indentured slaves in the future as lifetime slaves, right? Because they do this all the time. They use old cases in court and say, well, this happened because of this. This case got brought between the Supreme Court or this court, and they're allowed to use it. Life later. In 1657, Johnson's neighbor Edmund Scarborough allegedly forged a letter in which Johnson acknowledged a debt. Whether this debt was real or not is unknown. Johnson did not contest the case. Johnson was illiterate and could not have written the letter. Nevertheless, the court awarded Scarborough 100 acres of Johnson's to pay off his alleged debt. I mean, so when you make a contract, there's nobody to oversee it or make sure it's legal. I don't know about that. It's weird. So let's move on. Anthony Johnson moved his family to Somerset County, Maryland, where he negotiated a lease on a 300-acre plot of land for 99 years. Wow. He developed the property as a tobacco farm in which he named Torrey Vineyards. Wow, sounds Spanish to me. Torres? No, either what? I think it is Torres. Some people pronounce things different. So either way, Torres or Torres is no coincidence that when we look at his genealogy, Mary survived, and in her 16 what? Mary survived, and in 1672, she pretty much gave a cow to her grandson. That's what they're saying. Yeah, I think he died in 1670. So that's why they're saying Mary survived. And research indicates that when Johnson died in 1670, his plantation was given to a white colonist. Okay, not to Johnson's children. A judge had ruled that he was not a citizen. A citizen of the colony. I didn't really know you could be a citizen back then because he was black. You really think that's true? This man got all this advantage. His wife didn't have to pay taxes for years. His wife and his daughter didn't have to pay taxes for the rest of their life. They got all this land. They got people to be slaves forever. And they're talking about because he wasn't what do you call it? He wasn't a citizen of the colony and he was black. They didn't call people black back then. Black was made up all the way in the 1800s, right? When people had to start losing their nationality, where they came from, because they came from Europe and all these other places. They knew who they were, but if you want to be in the United States or stuff like that, you had to start going by these legal fiction names, right? Black, Negro, white, all this nonsense. So black was not around in the 1600s, right? Because he was black. In 1677, Anthony and Mary's grandson, John Jr., purchased a 44-acre farm, which he named Angola. John Jr. died without leaving his heir. However, by 1730, the Johnson family had vanished from historical significance Genealogy research suggests that some of Anthony's other descendants moved to Delaware and North Carolina. And yes, much of this is true, but much of it is a lie. When we go back and look at his genealogy, black people turned into white people. When you go look at his genealogy. Um, so again, what you guys got to understand here is that let me see if I can pull up this guy's genealogy real quick. All this was going on up until Civil War, where black people was owning all this land and were businessmen owning black slaves, owning white slaves that were indentured. So let's look at this guy's genealogy. Um, and we're going to look at his family tree. So this guy's name is Anthony Edmund Johnson. That's what they're claiming. Anthony Edmund Johnson when we look on his family tree, right? Um his that lady they were talking about that he married, her name is Maria Mason. Mason with the E. Now, they don't say where her parents came from. Anthony Johnson, Edmund Johnson, we don't know where this Edmund came from, but his mother is named Soyo. She was born in 1580 in Angola. Angola. Incredible. This guy's really got genealogy. A guy that was a slave, and his parents had genealogy. Wow, this is crazy. Anthony Edmund Johnson, that we just talked about in this whole story, his father is named Juan D'Angela Johnson. And guess what? He was born in Portugal, right? Portugal. So his father is Portuguese, not African. Not African. Portugal. His father's Portuguese, and his mother is Angolan. Wow. So wouldn't if they go by patriarchal system, like I said before, you are what your father is. He's Portuguese. He's Portuguese, right? The Anthony Johnson. And then they had all these children. And what I want you guys to remember, I keep saying this isn't just about this guy. He's most recognized for being able to keep slaves for life, indentured slaves for life. He did particular people out there saying he started slavery for life, but this wasn't in every case in all the colonies. What they could do was they could go back and look at this. We'll do a video on when they started in the United States or the 13 colonies where slavery was for life. And if I'm not mistaken, that was in the 1800s. I want to say the early 1800s when people became slaves for life. This was a Supreme Court ruling, right? This wasn't no local ruling like it was in this case, even though Virginia was some of the first slaves, right, who were indentured. Let's look at this guy's family tree right here. Where were we? Okay. So all his daughters, he had 1, 2, 3 daughters and 2 sons, right? So all the daughters, well, 2 of the daughters got married. Hold on. No, 1 of the daughters got married out of the 3. So the other 2 daughters, hold on. No, 2 of the daughters got married. So the Johnson name got wiped away, and it went to the George and Johnson. No, one. No, he only had $2. And one got married. The other one didn't, but the one that got married didn't carry on that last name. One of the three sons didn't get married and didn't have no children. The two other sons, let me see. No, he only had two sons. But only one son got married, had kids, and carried on the name. Remember the John Johnson Jr.? Well, he carried on the Johnson name, and one of his great grandsons was Anthony Johnson, and that's where the family turns white in 1710 with Thomas Johnson. Yeah, that's where it turns white. Nevertheless, people, we probably can sit here all day and just try to find this guy's some more of his history and more of his genealogy, but it's plain and clear when we look at it from the beginning. And some people that did stories on this guy that he really did not come from Africa, Angola. There's no such thing as Angola back then. Then in the first place, his father was Portuguese, and I gotta tell you guys, I mean, there's a lot of information out there of a lot of black people being um, in Spain back in the day, especially with the Moors. They ran Spain and didn't give it up until 1492 or something like that. And it continued to be a lot of black people in there, even though they lost that empire. So a lot of black people ruled Spain for a long time. And just because you lose the empire, that's to who was it, Isabel, and the new Spanish people, it doesn't mean nothing. It don't mean that people are leaving. There'll still be people in Spain. So a lot of this history is a lie. And like I said, I didn't want to bring you the Jim Crow story because it really makes no sense. Black people was balling out during slavery, balling out during slavery. And like I said, I'm gonna bring you the other video of when slavery actually started for a lifetime in the Americas. Well, in the United States, it wasn't until the 1800s, and we're going to talk about why they wanted to end slavery. It had nothing to do with helping black people. Nothing. The North, the North wasn't getting paid their money. The North wasn't getting paid their money, so they wanted to stop slavery. hmm They wanted to stop slavery, and we can prove that later on. But yeah, man, they've told black people this big fib, this big fib that don't make no sense. That don't make. I'm not trying to say no black people were slaves, but it wasn't like that, man. It ain't like what they're telling you. It wasn't nothing like they were. Imagine what they're trying to tell you. They're trying to tell you in a fake story. They're trying to tell you they brought over all these African slaves, stuffed in a ship, chained up. Where's the fresh water? I mean, they're on this voyage for like a month or more on the seas. Where's the fresh water? Women on their periods, um, no food. The people on the ship is barely surviving, and you're bringing all these people over at one time. And when you go back and look at how much these slaves were getting sold for, they were getting about $800 to $3,200, depending on their craft. They just weren't bringing some slaves over here that didn't know what they was doing. No, you got to go back and look at the records. These people will tell you anything now in the world of commerce. You got to remember what the world of commerce is. It's imaginary. People out here trying to make money. But there's some good people out here telling the truth. I just feel sorry for a lot of black people because they really think they came from slave ancestry. And a lot of people think they came from Africa when they didn't. A lot of them came from Europe. with these last names. As you can see, this guy came over here with the Johnson name. He wasn't no stolen slave. His father was named Johnson. He already came over here as Johnson. So because he probably wasn't even born. I'm not sure if he was born over here, but his parents might have brought him over here on ship manifest. We might have to look at that, but they're making you pay a lot of money to look at those ship manifests. And a lot of people done did the videos where they can see all these black people coming over here from Europe with first names, last names, family crest, everything. They weren't slaves. I'm talking about in the 1700s, 1600s, 1800s. I don't know if if I get a big following, yeah, I'll pay for it, but I'm not going to pay for all that stuff, man. You got to pay to get all that stuff. So history is crazy, man. That's why they try to keeping this whole thing alive. All this racial stuff, all this slave stuff, because people really woke up and realized and go back and look at documentation. All this stuff is documented. That's what's so crazy. And people is lazy. But these people back then were brilliant. They knew documents and contracts and everything meant everything to run in the world. And the people have all the access to this stuff. And they dumb. They won't even go look it up in the law library, in the Congress, everything. These people is keeping all this stuff. And they give you a chance to go look at it. And the people won't, because they believe some shit that's been told on TV. Nobody ever said that so-called black people in this country are African Americans. Jesse Jackson said that. And then they put it down on a piece of paper, and these people said that's what they are. The government never said that it was this. This is the name that so-called African Americans ran with because they heard Jesse Jackson. There was no such people. I'm trying to tell you. Now they can call you these names because you accepted them. People weren't calling themselves that back then. This guy called himself Portuguese. Right? And his mother was from Angola. But you got to remember, the Portuguese set up in Angola. It wasn't Angola back then. No such thing. That was a trade post. So, you guys ain't looking at this right, man. You go back and look at a lot of history. Pirates. What do they have? Dreadlocks. So I'm going to leave it at that, man. You guys, you got to figure a lot of stuff out, man. They ain't going to tell you. All this stuff out here is about race-based, and about hate and fighting. And, even a lot of your black celebrities, they know all this stuff. They got money invested, man. And all this nonsense is going on. It's all fake. History is all fake. They tell you slavery happened, but they ain't got to tell you how it really happened, right? Because it's documented. What I'm telling you here is documented. Now, it's out there for public record. Now, it's your duty as a human being, a person, a man, to go look at these documents, to go find out this history. Other than that, they don't have to point you in the direction. All this is public record. This guy's genealogy is public record. Everybody's genealogy is public record. And when you go look at some of these people that celebrities, you want to laugh because they aren't who they say they are. These presidents aren't who they say they are. Michael Jackson isn't who he say he is. Well, who they are saying who he is. And his family wants genealogy trumps everything. People is stupid. Like I said, I didn't know who my family was until I started doing genealogy. Okay? I didn't know who I was, where I came from. I just thought, okay, because this is what they saying in school. No, what they told me was a lie. It was a lie. Ain't no cotton swab and all that stuff in your mouth gonna tell who you are. All this is for, what do you call that? Entertainment. That's already been exposed for entertainment in the world of commerce. Once you walk outside that door, you're in the world of commerce. That's all you're in. This is not a real world that you're in. What you're doing in the legal world. It's not. It's not a real world. People got to wake up. These people that were coming over here from Europe, from Spain, a lot of these people was black. A lot of these kings and queens, they was black. I know that's going to hurt a lot of people's feelings. A lot of people going to get mad. But this is what it is. It's in the Congress. It's in the records of the United States. And in Britain, a lot of these people was black. It wasn't slaves. You got to remember, it's a lot of black families from Europe that's invested in the laws right now. These people are billionaires. You never see them. You never meet them. You never know them. They don't put their family and themselves out there. You never know them. And a lot of these celebrities, um, you never know their family. The families, the parents that they show you are not their parents. It's crazy. They'll never put their people out there. So the people that's running this whole thing, you'll never see them. The people that you do see are puppets and overseers that give you a fake story about history. But the good thing is, you can go back and you can look at the records. They're not allowed to keep that from you. It's public record about the world, about the United States. Who is who? What happened? All this is public record. What they're telling you in school is half truths. So, I mean, hopefully I didn't offend nobody or make anybody mad, but sometimes the truth is the truth. I mean, like I said, I'm if you want me to help you out with your genealogy, let me know. Maybe we can come up with something. You can donate, but I know genealogy inside out. This is easy. All I need is a name. That's all I need is a name, because everything is documented in this country, and it just don't go back to right now or a century ago. This stuff was documented since the Egyptian times. They know what's going on. I done found my people all the way back in the United States until the 1600s. I done found my people out of the United States all the way until the 1200s. I'll tell you, these people didn't play around as far as documentation. You wasn't just coming over in some ship. Ship to do what? With a whole bunch of slaves? No. They wanted to know who they are, where they come from, their age, their name, what they do as far as the trade, or they sew, or they good at cooking. They wasn't bringing these people over if they was worthless, because they was selling them. And some of them pretty much were selling themselves just to get over here. They wanted to get out of Europe. It was filthy. It was nasty. People was dying. It was crowded. And they wanted to come over here and work and get there. That's what they was told. The same thing you heard up in here, to get that land. If you get that land, you can become rich, because that's pretty much where all the money was. And that's why all these black Europeans was coming over here. Or black Spaniards. The story they telling you is idiotic. There was no racism back then. We could do a whole video on that and show you all the mixed families in the 17 and 1800s. I mean, it wasn't mixing like Latin America, but it was prevalent. What is a Spaniard? A person that's black and white. People mixing. We act like it was all these different races in America. Oh man, God made black, orange, white, green, blue. No. White person and a black person mixed, or had a baby. They were now mixed. Later on, these people just start calling themselves Spanish and speaking Spanish. That's all it is, son. It ain't that difficult. Mixed people just didn't pop up on the planet out of nowhere. I mean, it's ridiculous. Black people and white people was mixing for centuries. Racism is something new. The only thing it's ever been was family. So, you guys tell me what you think, man. I just want to give my spin on this. A lot of people have different spins, and it's a lot of people that don't want to tell the truth about this thing. Don't think we're using him as he's the guy that caused slavery forever. No, he ain't. I'll tell you, this was just a case in Virginia.